Have you ever sat back and thought, why aren't we being given the right information? Why is the default to get us scared? And why is the default to put out the information that all this is happening and it's out of control? I mean, do you think it's because it was a knee-jerk reaction in the beginning and now everyone's kind of covering their traces and covering their back? And I get that feeling in the UK where it's like we're basically coming out of lockdown almost 100%, but it felt like they couldn't do it 3 or 4 weeks ago because it would make everybody look stupid for doing it in the first place. I don't know. Have you ever tried to get your head around why we're not being told the truth?
Yeah, on a minute by minute basis. Like I keep looking around at this country in dumbfounded, just my poor wife. She has to hear me like lose my mind every 5 minutes because I just can't believe we're doing this. But what I have to keep reminding myself is we had an irrational belief that led to our behavior of terrifying virus, lockdown, it's killing everybody. And so we missed an opportunity to manage those conditions correctly. And that's something we might want to get into. We mismanaged those. And so we created high mortality in our hospital systems because we were mismanaging these patients as if they were infected when they weren't. And so with that fear paradigm merging, we started to make irrational decisions that weren't based on the dynamics of the virus or the dynamics of the comorbid conditions that were actually putting everybody at risk. And so we created an irrational thing. There is no rational recovery from an irrational. Adopted a bunch of irrational behaviors to resolve the irrational, response, and that's what we're seeing. And so I have to keep excusing, human nature here. It's like nobody can sweep in with a rational, solution to the situation that's so far from the reality that there's no way to bring everybody, legislators, regulators, public health officials whose responsibility is to keep people healthy, and you've given them an artificial paradigm or a completely erroneous and irrational paradigm, and you're telling them to get people out of this irrational situation. So my heart is literally going out to those people that are given responsibility for getting us out of the situation, because you are screwed. There's no way for you to make an intelligent decision because there is no right data for you to look at, because the data that got you to where you were was so wrong. And so at some point, we need to come to terms with the fact that with this next pandemic that's going to happen, and again, in the next 24 months, I'll show you where the next one comes, because all I have to do is show you how much Roundup is being sprayed into the soil, how much antibiotic is used in the animals being grown in that environment, the swine and the poultry and the like, and then how much air pollution is combined with that. And we can tell you where the next, extreme stress of extinction is going to happen, and the next paradigm is going to collapse. Or the next paradigm of collapse is going to emerge. When we see the collapse, we need to take a rational response to that. That next paradigm needs to be, we have a perturbation in nature and our relationship to nature here, and it's expressing itself as a new viral pandemic. We need to connect everybody back to nature as fast as possible to stop this pandemic from killing people. And in fact, we did that by mistake, and we locked everybody down. And the result was we stopped planes, we stopped all of the carbon particulate matter in the air, we stopped farming, we stopped spraying. In fact, there was a cessation of the pipeline of Roundup from China being produced in China to the United States, and suddenly farmers couldn't get their cheap glyphosate and Roundup, and they had to stop spraying. And I was just like dancing in the streets. I was like, finally, like it wasn't the science, it wasn't anything that made this rational decision to stop spraying chemicals into our soil. It was actually a false belief in a virus, or a false understanding of that virus, that led to the right response, which was stop freaking killing the planet for a moment. And in Hubei province, we have the most beautiful demonstration of this. Hubei typically will have 150 to 200 microns of this carbon particulate air pollution per cubic meter. And by the time they had been in lockdown for 6 weeks, it had gone below 35 microns. We haven't seen that in decades in China, that low of air pollution counts. And as soon as it went below 40, the mortality from COVID suddenly stopped and it flatlined. And everybody in the world was just screaming, well, China's lying, China's lying. They just aren't telling us the truth anymore. Maybe, but I can tell you there's a very good physiologic explanation why suddenly the mortality rate went so low. Is because they cleaned up the atmosphere indirectly. And so with this next fall coming on, we're going to see another surge of all of the respiratory conditions out there, from pneumococcal bacterial pneumonia to COVID or whatever you want to blame it on, but we're going to see an abnormal relationship with airborne pathogens again because of the amount of carbon particulate that starts in the second week of November. And that accumulation of carbon particulate in the air throughout the world is the result of the silencing of the soil in fall and winter. When the northern hemisphere goes into its fall and winter state and stops pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, we get a rapid accumulation of carbon. And every year in the third week of November, we say flu season starts. Flu is there the first week of November. Flu is there the first week of October. And yet we don't see mortality from it because we are in a better homeostasis with it. Flu season is carbon toxicity season. That's it. And there's no way you can create population statistics so perfectly even with the seasons that can be mapped at their beginning and their endpoint to the week every single year. There is no way that pandemics are happening like that. The viruses are always present. Through the toxification of our air and soil systems and the natural cycles of seasons, we lose our balance. And between the third week of October and the third week of November, we have an explosion of CO2, methane, and carbon particulate pollution in the air. That gets worse and worse and worse until May. And that's what we saw with COVID and all that, is this virus that binds to PM2.5. The virus is binding to that particulate matter and clumping, and therefore creating an artificial delivery system for the virus in the first place. And then when you get an artificially air pollution creation of a clump of viruses that now hits a lung that's been pharmaceutically upregulated to receive that virus, you get dumping of virus into that individual because of the air pollution, because of the seasonal shift in carbon particulate. And then on the back end of that PM2.5, you have cyanide. Cyanide is a very common particulate in air pollution from the energy sector. And in the United States, in fact, right before this pandemic, and so the pandemic hits December or whatnot, right before the pandemic in May, Earth Justice, one of our best kind of watchdog organizations of lawyers and kind of ecological watchdogs, sued the United States government for an failure to alert citizens of this rising amount of cyanide in many of our big cities that months later would be dying from COVID. Cyanide, as it turns out, when it enters the human system in abnormal amounts, will poison the red blood cells so that it can't carry oxygen. It causes something called histotoxic hypoxia. Histotoxic hypoxia caused by cyanide poisoning presents exactly like we said COVID presents. 5,700 patients admitted to New York hospitals were published, and they were published as their vital signs and their white blood cell counts, all of their laboratories. And in those 5,700 patients, the average temperature was stone cold normal. There was no fever as a presenting symptom. Their white blood cell count was stone cold normal. It was in fact, in the lower 1/3 of normal. So it wasn't even slightly moving towards elevated. And the lymphocytes, which are the specific white blood cells that would be upregulated in the event of an acute infection, were normal. There was no what we call left shift going on. And so I can tell you very confidently that the population of patients presenting with COVID, diagnosed with COVID, were not presenting with infection. They were presenting with hypoxia. And that's what was present in those 5,700 patients, was a lack of oxygen carrying capacity and early organ failure from hypoxia, namely the liver and the kidneys. And so with those 5,700 patients presenting with hypoxia, 2 to 3 days later, the lungs, after being injured by a hypoxic event, which is a lack of oxygen injury, it starts to fill with fluid naturally. And so if you have a drowning victim that's got a lack of oxygen, or you take somebody suddenly to Everest and they have, high altitude poisoning or sickness, what's happening is that hypoxic injury is causing damage to cellular systems, and the lungs fill with fluid a few days later. Fluid inside the lung creates an abnormal terrain, and you get bacteria that will collect there, and you'll get secondary infections of pneumonia, and the patient will die. Interestingly, the hypoxic injury also induces a broad spectrum change in our bloodstream, making us prone to blood clots, especially in micro blood vessels. And we are told that COVID causes micro blood clots, fluid accumulating in the lungs, and all of these downstream consequences of hypoxic injury that I believe was caused by not just cyanide, but many other of the hundreds of toxic chemicals in air pollution that are being brought into the human bloodstream by coronavirus unintentionally. Coronavirus is just floating out there as a genetic update to the population of the world, and then it clumps artificially to air pollution, gets zipped into the bloodstream in artificially high levels by the pharmaceuticalized lung, and then delivers the cyanide injury, and we get histotoxic hypoxia, and a few days later we die. It turns out that we're not dying from the virus. We're not dying of infection from a virus. We're dying of downstream secondary complications, including bacterial infections from a hypoxic injury. And it blew my mind when I started digging into this a few months ago. I uncovered this incredible document from an Archives of Medical History publication. It wasn't like your typical peer-reviewed science thing. It was looking at the history of syndromes and pandemics. And I found in there this description from a Chinese doctor of exactly what he was seeing on the front lines of SARS in 2002. And it reads, the patients are showing up blue with hypoxia, and then we have to sit and wait. Nothing works. And we sit and wait for their lungs to fill with fluid and then get secondary pneumonias and die. We knew 18 years ago that these patients weren't dying from an infection, and we did nothing. In fact, we tried to create a vaccine, and then we failed completely because we've never succeeded in an RNA vaccine. And then 2012, MERS hits, and the same phenomenon happens, this time coming out of the Middle East, but they're not really coming out of a location, right? They're coming from a biology that is finding, pockets around the world that are expressing the same biology. So why did it jump from Hubei province to suddenly northern Italy, being the second hotspot? That doesn't make sense for anything regarding the normal flu season. So what happened there? It turns out that you will find in northern Italy the highest concentrations of PM 2.5 carbon particulate matter in all of Europe, and the highest rates of Roundup spraying into the soil systems. And so my belief is the whole planet exuded this biologic update to coronavirus in hot pockets that were suffering from the same extinction capacity. We then went and gave that stress a name, and we called it COVID-19. That's just a name. Every year, viruses are exploding and out of very predictable terrain of damaged ecosystems and the like. And so now you ask, what about a vaccine? And with what you all know right now, from whatever we've said, does a vaccine make sense? Are we actually fighting anything? Is there something that we're failing to fight in this scenario that we've laid out?